Right, everyone, welcome to the webinar, Unpacking the UN's Plan on Plastic Pollution. I'm Mike Holman, SVP here at Lux Research, and moderating and participating in today's session with my colleague Anthony Schiavo, who's a senior director at Lux and has been leading a lot of our coverage around plastic waste and very closely following this, I think, really interesting, really relevant, and so far somewhat under-discussed work that the UN has been doing on addressing questions around plastic pollution, which could really have some major implications for the industry. So we're going to be discussing that today, but we will also be taking some questions throughout the at the end of the session. So anytime throughout the webinar, you can type questions into the Q&A box on your screen. We'll answer as many as we can in the time we have. But if your question doesn't get answered or you think of another good one afterwards, please feel free to email that to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will get back to you on that as well. So without any further ado, Anthony, what's happening with the UN's plan on plastic pollution?
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you joining me for this. And I appreciate all of you taking the time out to listen to us and really dig in with us on the UN's plan on plastic pollution. This is going to be a bit more of a free-form webinar. Mike's going to be joining me on camera throughout the duration of this webinar, because what we're really going to be doing today is responding to the third working group meeting of the UN on this plastic plan. That third working group meeting was last week. It was the full week, and there was actually some pre-work that happened the week before. So it just wrapped up on Friday. And now that we're, a day or two sort of past that, we are able to kind of summarize and see where we're at, what happened. A lot did happen, and what it all means. So we're going to be really responding almost in real time to the developing story here at the UN. But I do want to start by going back a year to 2022. This is the UN Environmental Program, UNEP. This is the meeting where they agreed or resolved Resolution 514 to basically create this binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, I think is the full title. And this is basically a really important decision because what we see is that the future of all plastic production is really at stake here. This binding instrument, the draft of it, basically covers all production of plastics from and the life of plastics from all the way upstream, through the life, design, the types of chemicals, the types of products, the form factors, through then to recycling, end-of-life, disposal, waste management. So it's extremely broad-ranging in its potential scope, right? And thus really, really potentially impactful. This is a global, basically, regulation. So you can really think of this as, in some ways, a Paris Accords for plastics. And the big question that we want to get into is this going to be more like the Paris Accords, which were very ambitious, which maybe catalyzed a lot of activity globally, but I think have not really been completely successful. They have set a lot of voluntary targets that have been missed, right? Compared to something like the Montreal Agreement, which banned CFCs, right? Which was very detailed, very specific, very actionable, and really created a pretty dramatic set of actions on a very narrowly scoped project that had a very positive outcome in terms of the overall, the ozone, right? The ozone layer. So that's really the important thing here.
Yeah, and as it says on the screen there, right? We're talking not just about plastic waste, but potentially impacting primary plastic production itself, right? That's something that's very much on the table in this discussion.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on that. That's a big part of that's probably the most controversial part of the whole thing. And I also want to mention the timeline and talk a little bit about process and what is actually happening, because I think this is, policy in general tends to be pretty opaque mechanistically to our clients. And UN policymaking is extremely process oriented and opaque, right? So a little timeline here. March 2022, we signed this resolution 514. That sort of kicks off this whole process. In December, 2022, we had the first Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or INC, meeting. You're going to hear me throw around that phrase a lot, INC. That is basically the group of associated parties that are actually drafting this, the group of governmental parties that are actually drafting this regulation. In June, we had the second INC meeting, which is where we arrived at the so-called zero draft. This is another technical term. Basically, it is a draft regulation that has basically all of the options in it, and a very wide range of options, right? Sort of covering all the potential bases. And the goal is to narrow down from the draft INC regulation. Then, in November 2023, we had our third INC meeting. This is in Nairobi, Kenya. And that's where we are today, right? We are. That was last week. So we're right in the middle of this process. There'll be a fourth and I believe a fifth. I believe they did actually agree to a fifth INC meeting, the 4th in April, the 5th later in 2024. But they have an end of 2024 deadline. This was set in the 2022 resolution. So this is really fast. For the UN, I think for regulatory processes in general, 2 years is fast. And certainly for the UN, this is an absolute screamingly fast pace. The climate regulations took 20 years to get together, right? So we're much quicker, and that shows the urgency that people feel around this issue.
Yeah, and I think why it's also, as I said, maybe still flying a little bit under the radar. It's it's only been a year and a half basically since this whole process started, and it hasn't. Not everyone is quite caught up to it yet.
Yep, I want to take a moment to actually talk about what happened this week. Like, what was the actual sort of legal or mechanical processes that happened. Basically, what we saw was that zero draft has been available. All of the countries, or a really wide range of countries, prepared basically statements or submissions to the committee that are essentially modifications to the zero draft. They are options, they are tweaks to the language, they are deletions of sections, they are additions of whole other sections. And, the United States, for example, I think submitted 15 or 17 of these. India submitted 14 of these. And the groups, essentially, during this session, more or less collated all these suggestions and put them into an expanded draft, right? Which actually has the perspectives of all the countries sort of in it. So in a real sense, we've gone the opposite direction of where we wanted to go, right? And this is one of the things that people are already kind of upset about, or already sort of regarding as a failure in this session, is that we've actually dramatically expanded the number of options that are on the table. We now need to kind of start packing back, and that's what we're going to do over the next 2 INC meetings. It is really hacking back these options into a single sort of regulation. But what's interesting, and one of the big things we'll be talking about, is we actually have more or less position statements from a lot of individual countries on a lot of the actual provisions. So we can really start to see where these different countries fall and where the actual draft is likely to end up. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics, some of the people in the room, right? And the big split, the big sort of, dividing line is between the High Ambition Coalition on one side. This is the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution. This is a official group of countries and the European Union, as well as Japan, Canada, Republic of Korea, Mexico. All the EU countries are part of this. There's also a large number of island nations and nations in Africa. I believe Kenya is a member. And they are pushing for a more aggressive, right, more ambitious set of regulations. Although, as we'll discuss, there's actually some pretty significant variation within what the HAC is actually calling for. And then there's been a group of countries that have been sort of resisting this ambition. Now, this has been pretty informal, and I have sort of dubbed these countries the Low Ambition Coalition in some of my previous writing about this. But one of the things that actually happened in a kind of surprising turn was we got the announcement of the Global Coalition for Plastic Sustainability. Um, this was announced during the like pre-working sessions, so basically like the week before. This was actually announced by Iran. You see the member countries here: Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, Bahrain, Iran, and Cuba. Um, this is a group of countries that has explicitly called for the focus of the uh, binding instrument to really be on end of life recycling, and specifically not on like limits to production, right? This is so new. They don't have a logo. They don't have a website, as far as I'm aware. And this was really quite a shock, to a lot of the folks in the room, right? And I also want to mention, in the room, we also have a ton of lobbyists and NGOs. So lobbyists from the chemicals industry, lobbyists from Greenpeace. Every I think 150 different lobbying organizations were registered and in the room around that number. So it's really quite a significant amount of different voices in the room, right?
But yeah, notably, not pictured in either of these coalitions is
Yes.
the U.S.
Our rogue nation, the U.S. The U.S. is interesting. I want to mention them. The U.S. has really been splitting the difference on a lot of stuff. Some of the things they've done have been fairly low ambition-y, but they've actually supported a fair number of relatively high ambition approaches as well. So we'll touch on that. So I want to walk through 4 or 5 big areas of sort of contention and discussion. We'll talk about what actually happened last week. So one of the big things, and one of the things that was really unusual and sort of reflected how divisive this session was, is on the process. Process rules have still not been fully finalized, which is very unusual. We're now a year into this, and typically this is the first thing that you do: is you finalize, you get all the process stuff figured out. Particularly, how are we going to make decisions? How are we going to adopt different things, right? And the delegates have so far basically been unable to agree on how to do this. And the particular issue is, how do we adopt different elements of the resolution? What basically happened, there's 2 approaches, right? There's consensus, which is everyone agrees, and then there's like a 2/3 majority voting. 2/3 majority voting is a lot less restrictive. You can get much more ambitious regulation passed that way. Consensus is a lot more constrictive. You have, a small number of countries can basically really control the whole process, or limit the process. It looks like we are going to end up with a consensus type of decision-making process. It's still somewhat unofficial, and it's actually still very confusing. I don't know if anyone really, frankly, I don't even know if the delegates really know what's going on. But basically, the organizing committee for this, the commissioner, put out a statement saying that, in light of the fact that we haven't been able to really decide, we're going to go ahead by consensus, unless there's a situation where we really definitely extremely can't decide what we're going to do. And then we'll default back to 2/3 voting. But don't worry, we're not going to do this. Kind of a very wishy-washy statement, and really sort of reflecting, really tough to parse. And there's still a lot of uncertainty. But all this uncertainty, all these difficulties, they're going to limit the scope of the instrument. And I think this is one of the big signals, really firm signals to me that puts us a bit of a stake in the ground in terms of where this thing is going to actually end up. And I think, we'll talk about it at the end, but we do now have a much better sense of where this thing is going to end up, and how narrow or broad the scope is going to be. And, in particular, this is a thing that's going to limit the scope of this overall arrangement.
Maybe one other sort of process thing, Anthony, is whether this gets adopted by consensus or 2/3 majority. To my understanding, right, there's not anything. It's like it doesn't go to the Security Council from there, or
No.
what this group decides is what's going to go into effect.
Yeah, this is really separate from those other mechanisms. So this group will ratify, does have to ratify something, like a plan. A set of binding instruments are going to be put in place in 2024. It's already been decided. We are now just in the process of agreeing what those look like. And there is a firm deadline for that to happen in 2024. So this doesn't go to the Security Council. Something will be produced by the end of 2024. I mean, maybe there'll be a delay and they'll miss the deadline, but a legally binding instrument is going to manifest. And speaking of that, one of the big things is how does this actually get put into the sort of the structure? Like, what does the structure actually look like? And one of the big areas is national plans, right? This is basically one of the things that they like to do is they say, okay, we're going to ask all the nation states to develop a plan to combat all these issues. And there's a very wide range in what this can, excuse me, what this can look like. And what we see is that the EU, as an example, as part of that high ambition coalition, is pushing for strong national plans that have mandatory action on all the points listed in the draft. So essentially, everything from primary plastic production through to waste management, marine plastics, litter, recycling systems, all of this stuff. They're saying you have to have a national plan, and it has to have all these elements in it, and they have to have like mandatory actions in them. Basically, that's like the really strong version of this. The U.S. is pushing for like a much looser type of thing, where it's like, yeah, you need to have a national plan, but it has to cover everything, but you could pick your own targets, right? And it can be a lot more loosey goosey. And then something like China is basically saying, hey, like we can have you can do a national plan basically if you want, right? So again, it seems like we're going to have a pretty loose, probably a voluntary, national plan here, where the maybe the creation of the national plan is mandatory, but all the actions within it are voluntary. So there's not as much legally binding force put behind that. So this is another thing that's going to limit the potential impact here. And I mentioned earlier plastics production. This is probably the most contentious issue at stake here. So I showed you section 1, right? Earlier, and that was this part of the draft that covers the overall production of plastics and the overall production of primary plastics in particular, not just recycled plastics, right? Basically, what we have is a bunch of position papers now from a number of countries, including China, including India, that and I believe Russia as well, basically saying the scope of the resolution in 5.4 or 5.14, this resolution that kicked off the whole thing, doesn't even cover primary plastics production, right? Like, this is totally out of scope for the whole document. So there should not be any consideration of primary plastics production, or even something like just national reporting of plastics levels, production levels. Like, anything to do with primary plastics production is out of scope, right? That's basically been the position of this low ambition coalition, or especially this coalition to global coalition versus plastic sustainability, right? They're really coming out against this. And this is probably going to limit the impact here. I will say what's interesting is that even like some members of the high ambition coalition are actually somewhat vacillating on this, prevaricating, right? We have Japan. They put out a positions paper on this issue, and it was really, really weaselly. It was very funny. They're like, well, like plastics production, it is in scope, but we really need to consider the national situation of each one of these countries, and like the appropriate, level of sort of response, and like, we have to consider if like there are these, is this really going to be beneficial in the long run with the whole thing? So they put out this position paper. They're like, yeah, we should do something, but like very much trying to water this down to like the greatest degree possible, right? And of course, it's the countries that don't have significant plastic production centers, the island nations, your Kenyas of the world, who are sort of most strongly in favor of this type of thing. Ultimately, it seems like whatever we get here, it could be very limited, or indeed, it's entirely possible we don't get anything on plastic production at all. That's certainly the position of a lot of big countries, and that's going to make it very hard to go forward. especially if we have consensus decision making as the approach. Then we have waste management. So this is everything from recycling to collection and cleanup. Um, this is where we really see the most consensus, I would say. We had a lot of different groups, you know, offering different opinions on things, but mostly it was on implementation here. So one thing that's really emerged as actually increasingly popular is extended producer responsibility. Um, you have a pretty wide range of groups, including like China, for example, endorsing an extended producer responsibility. Um, you have the U.S., open to nationally defined, but still open to extended producer responsibility as part of the binding instrument. Basically, the instrument would direct all these countries to have a national level EPR scheme. You have the EU strongly pushing for it, groups like Japan pushing for it as part of the high ambition coalition. So it seems like extended producer responsibility has a pretty significant foothold and a pretty significant amount of traction within this group of international countries. One other thing that's also fairly contentious, but still, I think. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, just to say, like, extended producer responsibility schemes are, for those that may not be familiar, it's essentially requiring plastics producers, like the plastic producers and the CPG companies that are using plastic packaging to contribute towards the cleanup of and the recycling of that plastic packaging at end of life.
Yeah. So it's a way of managing the costs. It's a way of basically funneling resources from the production of plastics to basically the management at the end of life.
Yeah, recycling infrastructure and all that.
Yeah, recycling infrastructure, but especially collection infrastructure, right? This is really the big gap here. And a big part of EPR is collection. The other thing I'll mention here is materials of concern, and particularly chemicals and plastics of concern, because there's actually a whole section in the draft regulations around plastics of concern, and basically saying, look, there are certain plastic articles, there are certain plastic products that we will designate of concern, and this is basically a language that's lifted from some of the Basel Convention work, where basically we define chemicals of concern and regulate them out. So things like persistent organic pollutants. This is a pretty well-trod framework. And what's interesting is that this draft regulation potentially expands and applies this to plastics, although exactly which plastics and what conditions, not really defined yet. This is definitely more controversial. You have groups like China, like pretty firmly coming out against it. They released their version of the draft of this section, and it just has cut out, like, everywhere it says chemicals and plastics of concern. They've just deleted the word plastics and plastics. So it's just like, they're like, yeah, no, we're not labeling any plastics of being of concern at all, right? They're completely against that. But even a group like India is open to this type of thing. The statement from India was basically, yeah, we actually have to define what plastics of concern mean, but like we're open to discussing it. And even the U.S. and certainly the EU, this is an area where the EU is strongly pushing for mandatory removal of plastics of concern, mandatory restrictions on those types of use and production there. So it's pretty significant area of some controversy, but possibly an area where we could get some action. And then recycling and circularity. This is a really interesting one. Honestly, this is one where we didn't see nearly as much commentary as you might expect, right? I think generally speaking, everyone wants this thing to promote recycling. But the context, it's really the context in which recycling gets promoted that matters a lot, right? And it's really all the bits and pieces that surround this, right? So when you look at the incoming submissions from the countries, it's focusing on financing. There's a lot of discussion of financing and how that would actually work. There's a lot of discussion around these more controversial areas of, primary plastics, EPRs, materials of concern, but not nearly as much on recycling and circularity. But I think that the basic challenge is that, like, because there is so much like other issues, we're not seeing nearly as much like discussion and action on this area as you could be like seeing, right? And there are some really big questions that so far have been unaddressed, right? So, like, what is recycling? Like, does chemical recycling count? There's some really big questions in here that we basically haven't even gotten to yet, uh, as far as I can tell, in part of this process. To the extent that we've gotten to anything, right? And obviously, this is all still very much in the draft phase. But yeah, this is something where you would have expected to see more progress, I think, coming into this, because there is a fair bit of alignment, but we just don't really know what the status of this whole progress is, right? I'll also mention at this point single-use plastic bans. This is another part of the draft regulations. This is something that you have strong support from the High Ambition Coalition for, and a pretty mixed consensus from the Low Ambition Coalition, right? Pretty mixed results there from that global coalition for plastic sustainability. Certainly, I think groups are willing in practice, and like a lot of groups are touting their specific actions that they've taken. So like there's a very interesting statement from China as an example, where they said, China is actually really far ahead on single-use plastic bans. We have in coalition with the like international group of bamboo material producers, demonstrated the viability of like bamboo-based alternatives to plastics and all this stuff. And but I think everyone really wants to have their own control and their own sort of nationally defined bans and solutions. And I think you're going to see some single-use plastics bans here, but what the actual you're probably going to see a push for those to be defined on a national level, just given the diversity of resources and opinions on this whole area. And so when you take all this together, right, I think we are on track for a low ambition outcome, right? The combination, to me, the things that really speak to me, the combination of the process changes, right? The failure to agree on process, the formation of this official sort of low ambition, focused on recycling only coalition, the outright rejection by a lot of member countries of the scope of the resolution 514 to actually cover primary plastics production. All of this means we're going to be much more like the plastic Paris Agreement than the plastic Montreal Agreement, right? This is going to be a very ambitions heavy, action light document going forward. But even still, there's actually a lot of impactful stuff that's in here, and that is seemingly moving ahead. Like, this is going to push a long-term EPR scheme, right? I didn't get into it too much, but there's a lot of financing stuff that could happen here. This should really, and particularly for plastics collection, really help improve that in the developing world in particular, but also in some of these major economies that don't have nearly as much collection infrastructure as you might expect. But it's still not over, right? It ain't over till it's over. And a lot of this has not been decided. Even some of the process stuff, has technically not been decided. So we can see the shape of the outcome, and I am of the opinion this is going to be a bit of a lower ambition outcome. It's not going to be that huge disruptor for the plastics industry. There are going to be global reverberations and global ramifications from this, and it could still swing in a pretty big way. There could still be really big details that are very impactful. The mechanisms for funding, the exact wording of the national action plans, the whole thing on plastics of concern. There are some really significant areas where we could see some really big outcomes. So, we have to keep watching, and we have to keep tracking this as it goes forward. But I want to thank you, Mike, for joining me today. I want to thank our audience for joining us today. And we do have some time for questions. I believe Mike, you'll open it up to the floor questions, and I think you have some questions of your own as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And do keep those questions coming in. Type those into the Q&A box on your screen. We'll follow up if we don't get to all of them, which I think we probably won't.
Yeah, it looks that way.
One thing that's come up. Yeah, there's a lot to say about this, and I think one of the things that you mentioned, Anthony, is that the industry lobbyists have been involved here. So what is I'm sure a lot of that is in maybe not smoke filled, but back rooms, and kind of behind the scenes discussion. But what's your sense of what industry's role and ability to influence this process is here? Going especially going forward to the next fourth and potentially fifth meetings.
I mean, it's pretty significant. I would say that this global coalition for plastic sustainability is pretty much in lockstep with some very significant plastics producers, right? You look at Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco is largest oil and gas company in the world. Like, there's some very tight links there. China, Russia, there's some pretty tight links between industry and government there. Exactly what Cuba is doing in this group is a little questionable to me. They're typically actually a lot more aligned with the island nations on this kind of stuff, right? But you have a really
being an island nation,
being an island nation, I'm
not a
about
super
this.
big producer of primary plastics either.
Yes. So but even in the U.S., right, and even in the EU, you still have some pretty significant links between the governments and industry. And a big part of that is just a lot of this is going to be promotional, like promoting recycling, right? Building infrastructure, financing global collection of plastic waste, right? This is very important for the future of the plastics industry, the chemicals industry, right? So what's really unclear to me is more like the Greenpeaces of the world, how they factor in. Greenpeace's target is 75% reduction in plastics production by 2040. They put out a statement. They're one of the first people to put out a statement. They were like, "We're really unhappy with the outcome here." I'm like, "Well, okay, sure." Like, I get that it did not meet your goal, but it's
not
it's a little unrealistic. So it's a little unclear to me exactly what role they're playing. And I think what you're actually going to see is that a lot of those groups that are a bit more, not on the sort of the environmental activists, the role they'll really play will be at a national level, shaping the conversation around the specific outcomes there. Because I think that's where they have more sway.
Yeah, that actually gets to one of the other kind of interesting questions that came up, and we see this. It's been a big issue at the last at COP27, and I think will be again at COP28, is around funding for, I think, actually both mitigation measures and adoption of climate tech in the global south, the developing world, right? And how getting funding from the more developed countries is an important goal to support that, to support the global south. Is there a similar discussion that's happening here around?
Oh yeah, for sure. So what's really interesting here is you have this whole same very like funding argument where you have, we have some funding mechanism, we're going to define some contribution that countries can put in, and like you have the same kind of haggling over like, is it mandatory, is it not mandatory, this type of thing. But then you also have a lot more defined actions because, like, for example, there's a plastic tax that's been proposed, right, on production. So I think they're getting a lot more creative here in how they can potentially fund this type of thing. Because I think in a lot of ways it's easier to tax plastic than it is to tax carbon, right? It's just a lot more concrete, physical, and trackable. But I think you're going to see a similar fight. I don't think we're anywhere close to knowing what the actual funding situation is going to look like. I think that's going to be a real big battle. If the battle here was really about scope, was really about regulation of primary plastics, plastics a concern, I think the next session is really going to be about funding. And actually, there was a whole proposed set of intersessional works that actually failed to get approved again, kind of showing the level of discord in this group. And one of the things that was, I believe, failed to get approved was a series of intersessional works on funding. So that's really already gearing up to be a next big fight. You're on mute, Mike.
Maybe one last quick question there is there have you seen a lot about design for recyclability in the discussion here? Is that something that's potentially going to come in, or maybe it gets reflected more through the influence of these EPR schemes?
Yeah,
But has that
it's
been
one of
part
the
of the
things that's
discussions?
in the document. It's in the draft. There's regulations around the design. It's something that hasn't been discussed that much. It didn't seem to me to be a focus of the delegates or the focus of the nations this week, and in part because it's very high level. What's in the draft is like, hey, countries need to adopt some design principles or whatever, and we'll define some principles for that type of thing. And that's a really detailed, like, devil in the details type situation, and we just don't have the detail of what the actual thing is yet. I expect it's something that's going to be very nationally driven, and thus a pretty weak part of the overall document, especially compared to the single-use plastic bans, where you can,
Yeah.
I think, put a bit more of an impactful thing in still a very broad statement.
All right. Well, that is about all we have time for. But thanks very much, Anthony, for following all this and reading all those national plans and breaking it down for everybody here. The slide presentation and recording we will share out to all the attendees by email. When you exit, you will get a prompt to complete a survey about today's presentation. So we really look at those very closely and pay attention to them. So please take a moment to give us any feedback you have on the presentation. Check out some of the upcoming webinars that we have listed here. And thanks again for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.